We had an amazing time visiting San Francisco recently. It's a gem of a city with so much to offer in terms of interesting and vibrant neighborhoods, culture, history, architecture, and nature. Before you ask, yes, the city does have a dark side, and we'll talk about what this means for visitors later in the video. But San Francisco really is so much more than what you hear about on the news. In this video, we're going to focus on what made San Francisco such a good trip for us. It's a pretty good place to visit without a car.
Which is a relief because everywhere we looked there was a sign warning us about car break-ins.
We can enjoy a good road trip here and there, but for cities, there's nothing like exploring on your own 2 feet, supplemented by transit and cycling, of course.
Other parts of the Bay Area are more suburban, but San Francisco itself is generally compact and pedestrian scale. More than that, it's one of those dense, lively cities that's just inherently fun to be in and walk around. It's the kind of place where you're not just shuffling from one discrete tourist destination to another. The city streets and neighborhoods are themselves destinations to enjoy. You can walk for hours enjoying the shops, cafes, and restaurants on the commercial streets, and taking in the beautiful townhouses and old apartments on the nearby residential streets. San Francisco's housing politics are famously dysfunctional and hostile to new construction, but as tourists who aren't saddled with the sky-high rent, we're happy to enjoy the historic preservation and aesthetics of the older buildings. We loved seeing the pastel colors, stucco, mixture of Spanish and Victorian styles, and hippie history, including the Grateful Dead house. Coming from not Vancouver, Canada, the palm trees and semi-desert landscape in the Bay Area are also big novelties for us.
One caveat to San Francisco's walkability is the terrain. It's pretty well known for being an extremely hilly city, but that doesn't come through on a map. 2 streets connected by a parklet? Maybe that's traffic calming put in for COVID? Nope, steps for a steep climb. On the bright side, the extra dimension adds character to the city and provides constant opportunities for amazing views seemingly everywhere you look. Good enough that on some streets you might be tempted to walk backwards. Our favorite panoramic view came from the Twin Peaks in the middle of the city. We climbed a sketchy dirt path, but later found one of the roads up the hill closed to car traffic. So many of the city's parks are on hills, too, which really elevates the park experience.
We saw some cool urbanism projects, car-free Market Street, JFK Drive in Golden Gate Park, and miscellaneous slow streets in different neighborhoods, but it seemed like San Francisco, with its density, could easily support at least a half dozen fully pedestrianized commercial streets, in the same vein as Montreal. On our trip, we also walked around 2 other Bay Area cities or towns, Berkeley and Sausalito. Berkeley, to the east of San Francisco, has some excellent lookout points in the hills above the university, and Sausalito, across the Golden Gate Bridge to the north, has a nice lively downtown along the water, and a surprising amount of cycling.
Transit can also be a great way to see a city, at least when it's not underground. You can cover more distance than walking, without having to pay attention to driving or parking. We made the mistake of not taking the cable cars or historic streetcars because we just walked or biked in the areas they served, but in hindsight it would have been cool to hang off one of these. The streetcars are a regular transit fare, but the cable cars are more expensive. We did take the bus and light rail within the city. One day we walked from downtown to Ocean Beach, but took the light rail back, which was a good vantage point to see the less dense, but not exactly suburban neighborhoods on the west side of the city. If San Francisco's hills are an issue, city buses go up the Twin Peaks, and hop-on hop-off tourist buses take you around different neighborhoods.
Ignoring Caltrain, the other important transit option is BART, Bay Area Rapid Transit. It's an urban subway in San Francisco and Oakland that branches off to become suburban commuter rail, with lower frequency and more spaced-out stops in the East Bay. BART is the main airport connection, and we also used it every day because for this trip we stayed outside of San Francisco in Berkeley, on one of those suburban branches. Unfortunately, this meant trains weren't super frequent, every 15 minutes on weekdays and 30 minutes on weekends and holidays. One of the stations we used was also in a highway median, a loud and unpleasant place to wait 23 minutes for a train. Even as people who really prefer transit, we understand why someone might choose a car if they had to wait for a train here daily. On the plus side, we enjoyed the above-ground and elevated portions of BART. The new trains have some nice screens, trains have dedicated space for bikes, and you can get transit passes on your phone. We also enjoyed half-price fares when we were there due to BART's 50th anniversary.
After walking up to 20 kilometers a day for the first half of our trip, our feet started to get a little beat up, so we rented bikes to give them some rest and cover more distance. We ended up finding a bike rental in the most unlikely of places. The downtown Berkeley BART station parking garage has a bike repair shop that does rentals for $35 American a day, which was absolutely worth not having to constantly worry about docking a bike every 30 minutes with bay wheels, the local, more expensive version of Bixie. Also, as a bonus, we actually didn't have to return the bike until the end of the next day.
They offered us helmets, which we took because, well, California. These bikes were full of surprises. Bizarrely, they didn't come with kickstands. That has to be a mistake, right? Sure, you don't need a kickstand if you're racing or mountain biking, but for normal biking around the city, the kind of thing you do when you rent a bike from a transit station, kickstands are essential. No one wants to lean their bike against objects or lay it on the ground every time they're not using it. The second surprise is that these bikes had airless tires. That's right, completely solid, no air, no pumping, and no flat tires. These have downsides, but they're a neat option for rental bikes. The ride was maybe a little bumpier, but we didn't actually notice them feeling any slower than regular tires.
Unfortunately, the cycling experience in the Bay Area wasn't as good as the walking or transit experience in many ways. It wasn't the hills. They're a challenge, but they're not everywhere, and low gears are actually pretty good at their job if you can accept going slow. The main challenge was, like in most cities, unprotected and disconnected bike infrastructure. Shout out to some of the gems we encountered. Concrete protected bike lanes in Berkeley, a greenway under BART in Albany, sidewalk level bike lanes in Emeryville, and slow streets in San Francisco. But overall, our experience on both sides of the bay was carefully planning our routes using Google Maps and Street View, and spending way too much time off our bikes confirming directions. This sharply contrasts with the simplicity of walking, where you can just go in any direction and basically know that there will be sidewalks for you. This isn't to say the walking experience was perfect or anything. Anytime you walk near a highway, you experience the old, familiar, cars are king attitude.
A perception exists that San Francisco is overrun by homelessness and crime. We're not experts on the city, but we can tell you what we saw in September of 2022. Walking around, we definitely noticed the tents and presumably occupied campers, a stark reminder that housing is crushingly expensive in the Bay Area. But they're not everywhere, and they're not on their own threatening. We did see some scary behavior, hard drug use, and people acting erratically or aggressively. But that was mostly localized to the Civic Center UN Plaza area on the west end of downtown. We knew to avoid the infamous Tenderloin district nearby.
In December, Mayor London Breed called for a state of emergency in a notorious district called the Tenderloin.
But it happened to spill over to Civic Center and Market Street more than we expected. It was unpleasant for sure, but the vast majority of the city wasn't like this at all. Maybe it was more widespread and harder to avoid during the depths of COVID, but when we were there, it did not strike us as a reason not to visit.
One unfortunate exception to this stuff being localized and easy to avoid was transit, especially BART. It's not that we never experienced sketchy things on transit back in Canada, but it's not that common. In 1 week of taking transit in San Francisco, we saw people throwing glass bottles, punching windows, yelling threats, and spitting. We saw a drug deal. We saw someone, consuming hard drugs on the platform. Once our train stopped in Oakland for a few minutes as a K-9 police unit investigated another car. It wasn't every ride, but let's say every second or third ride. A local warned us about theft on BART too. This didn't stop us from taking transit, but it kept us on our guard and degraded the experience. And let's be real, lots of people will simply not use transit if experiences like this are too common, and we can't really blame them. We preferred getting off at Embarcadero Station over Civic Center or Powell Street downtown, and not just because it has a cooler name. If you're visiting and worried though, you can just stay in San Francisco itself to avoid the daily BART rides. Theft from parked cars is apparently an issue too, especially at tourist sites.
It was interesting seeing the popularity of e-scooters in the Bay Area. We have these back home too, and they're somewhat popular, but not like here. We probably saw as many e-scooters as bikes in day-to-day use, not counting the bike race we saw in San Francisco, or the enormous bike party we came across in Berkeley.
We were surprised on this trip at how expensive groceries and restaurants were. Canadians are used to going to the US to buy things for cheap, and while we knew California wouldn't be like the South or Midwest, we didn't expect groceries to be significantly more expensive than at home. But at least it's not as bad as housing.
Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. We're not going to pretend the city doesn't face some real issues, but all in all, we can still say that San Francisco was a great trip for us. It's an iconic American city, and we're almost surprised we hadn't visited earlier. Well, aside from it being located on the other side of the continent, 4,000 kilometers away. Anyway, a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.